Welcome everybody. My name is Dr. Lisa Baxter and I'm your University of Georgia State Forage Extension Specialist. In this presentation, we're going to talk about managing forages in drought conditions. This presentation is being recorded in the summer of 2024. Most of our state is facing some level of drought, and we're going to discuss how we characterize and manage around those different levels of drought in this presentation. To get started, there are several very helpful resources that I recommend you review from University of Georgia Extension. The one there working left to right, we have drought management strategies for beef cattle, and so this includes both herd management and some on the forage side. Similar to that, we have forage use and grazing herd management during a drought, which is a longer, more extensive bulletin that directly follows along with what we're covering in this presentation. And then finally, the one there on the right is a short circular just on nitrate toxicity. We will touch on that briefly in this presentation, but I strongly recommend reviewing that circular. Each of these bulletins is linked in our video description below and is available from the University of Georgia Extension website. So starting off, we have the early stages of drought. Some characteristics of this is when rainfall has failed to keep up with our evaporative demand, which means our daily ET, or evapotranspiration, is exceeded our precipitation for several days. Evapotranspiration is simply the loss of water to the atmosphere from both evaporation and transpiration. At this point, forage growth has begun to slow down, and we can see that this effect is masked if you have low fertility or pH in your pasture or hayfield. The blades of the grass are starting to curl in the midday heat, and you may see that the grass is starting to have kind of a blue-gray tint instead of the bright green color that we expect. The grass is becoming less and less resilient, and we see that visibly by its response to vehicle and animal traffic. The tire tracks are going to remain apparent in that field for 1 to 2 days after you've driven through it. Rainfall is unlikely in this scenario in the next 3 to 7 days, so we encourage you to watch the forecast to see if that keeps us in the early stages of drought, or do we need to start thinking ahead to the next level. Some tactics that we can follow when we are in the early stages of drought are listed here. At this time, it is time to start actively planning, not just talking about hypotheticals, but making an active plan. We need to lower our stocking rate by increasing the area being grazed by the current number of animals or reduce the number of animals. When we start to evaluate our supplemental feed options, we need to consider both the price per pound of each nutrient and not just the total price. We want to create an inventory for our resources. Be sure to test your forage to know what type of supplement is needed. We want to make sure that we are developing rations that are balanced to help maintain these cows at a body condition score, or BCS, of at least 5. We should review or develop, if we have not already, a cull priority list. We need to sell cows that are open, older than 10 years old, or did not wean a calf. If we have calves that are at least 7 months of age, they need to be weaned. We want to examine all of our herd records to see which animals are going to most likely yield that long-term return on the money that we are investing in our hay and our supplement. Again, continue to monitor weather conditions to know when to start putting this plan into place. As the drought continues to advance, we move into what is called an advanced stage of drought. And some characteristics of that really follow along with the drought effects becoming more and more evident. Our daily evapotranspiration, or ET, is again exceeding that precipitation for even more days. As the drought becomes more advanced, our forage species begin to go dormant. Drought alone will rarely kill a forage species in our state, but overgrazing forages during this stress event can cause problems with our persistence. Height is decreasing in our fields because the animals are grazing the forage noticeably faster than the rate at which that forage is regrowing. At this point, our forage growth has either slowed dramatically or stopped completely. The blades of the grass are curling all day, not just in the midday heat. The grass has that blue-gray tint to it with the brown tips, and the average pasture height is steadily decreasing. More animals are being sold to market, and so the market price that you could expect for your culled animals has decreased slightly, but likely not sharply yet. Again, once we hit an advanced stage of drought and we are starting to look at the tactics that need to be in place, rainfall would be unlikely and expected within the next few weeks. Once we reach that advanced stage of drought, it is time to start taking actions and enacting the plan that we made in the early stages of drought. Poor persistence of our forages leads to weed encroachment and soil erosion, which can be costly to you as a producer in the future. We need to continue to reduce our stocking rate and maintain a minimum stubble height of at least 2 inches in Bermuda grass, 1.5 inches in Bahia grass, and at least 2.5 to 3 inches in tall fescue. We want to choose our sacrifice areas carefully. It's important to restrict access to the entire pasture or farm. This is going to help limit the damage that we see from overgrazing to specific areas instead of the entire pasture. We can go back later and renovate these sacrifice areas following the drought, but we only want to allow limited access to the rest of those pastures for a brief period. We need to carefully examine the cost associated with feeding hay and supplements. You should develop a ration based on the available feed and forage supplies and provide just enough to maintain a moderate body condition of around 5 for beef cattle. We know that dry females are going to have their lowest nutritional needs early to mid-pregnancy. Early weaning is a strategy used to maintain brood animals on those poor quality forages with little or no supplemental feeding, allowing the producer to then stretch the available feed sources. Early weaning and pasture supplementation strategies for beef cattle are presented in the Drought Management Strategies for Beef Cattle Extension Bulletin, again linked below in the video description. You should view forage and feed supplements as investments, especially during a drought. Producers should invest only in animals that are likely to generate a return and should focus on those animals that will provide the highest returns. Carrying open, old, or unproductive animals through this level of drought is unlikely to be feasible. As our drought continues to worsen, the prices for those culled animals will drop quickly. Pay attention to the long-range weather forecast and the current market. Do not hesitate to lower the population early rather than too late. If no drought relief is in sight, we need to sell those low-priority animals before the market price declines sharply. When we are in the severe and extreme stages of drought, our forage is now extremely limiting. That daily evapotranspiration has exceeded precipitation for several weeks now. Forage growth has stopped, and all of our pastures are down to a minimal stubble height that we talked about during the advanced stages of drought. Any grass that's remaining is likely curled, brown, and may appear dormant. At this point, there would be a significant number of animals being sold around the state. Market prices for those cull animals has either begun to decrease and is likely decreasing sharply. This last point is extremely important. Rainfall in this scenario is unlikely in the next few weeks or prior to the exhaustion of our available feed supplies. Again, to reiterate, we are unlikely in this stage of drought to see that rainfall before we're going to run out of feed for the animals that we currently have on the farm. Because of that, we are going to take some more drastic actions once we reach this stage of drought. We're going to use our sacrifice areas very hard and graze those other pastures sparingly. We need to provide supplementation to the animals to keep a balanced diet, again to maintain those cows at a body condition score of 5. We want to reference our feed records and on the availability of the forage and the feeds. We need to use an up-to-date forage and feedstock inventory to calculate exactly how many animals, if any, the operation can feasibly carry through this level of drought. We want to focus our resources only on the best animals. Again, think of your hay, forage, and feeds as investments into your cattle operation. We want to cull more deeply based on that priority list that we made early on, which means we need to wean all calves that are at least 60 days of age or older and feed them an 80% grain and byproduct diet. We need to calculate how many animals we could feasibly carry based on the weather forecast and feed cost. I need to encourage you to be very, very conservative in that estimate and sell the remaining livestock. The overall goal with those tactics that we just presented is to protect the long-term forage resources on the farm. Our goal during these drought events, especially the advanced and extreme drought events, is not to maximize our forage or the animal productivity. We will very likely see a short-term loss of production. Our goal again is to protect this farm for in the future. So when the drought ends, what are some options that we have? First, we need to consider the pasture recovery time. We need to give those plants plenty of time to replenish their energy reserves in the roots. Increase your stocking rate very slowly. It's going to take time for that grass to be able to bounce back and achieve that stocking rate that you had before the drought. We want to wait at least 7 days after a drought-ending rain to return to grazing, especially on crops that are prone to prussic acid or nitrate toxicity. And finally, we need to make a renovation plan. Hopefully that renovation plan is only for your sacrifice area and not the entire farm. But depending on how long this drought persisted is how extensive that renovation plan will need to be. So prussic acid and nitrate toxicity are pretty similar, as you can see here. Prussic acid is only occurring in sorghums, Sudans, things like Johnson grass, etc. You may see this called cyanide poisoning or HCN poisoning. The toxicity comes from when the animal consumes a plant with the cyanogenic glycosides. The hydrogen cyanide is released and it interferes with the oxygen, which creates the animal suffocating. To avoid this, we don't want to graze immediately after a drought stress event or a plant stress event like drought, and split those nitrogen applications across the season. With nitrate toxicity, our nitrates are a common form of nitrogen in the soil that's readily taken up by the plants. The toxicity comes from when the animal consumes more nitrates than the rumen can safely convert into ammonia. The nitrite then enters the bloodstream, converts into hemoglobin to methylglobin, and removes oxygen from the blood. Again, we can split our fertilizer applications to avoid this, and don't graze immediately after a plant stress event like drought. If there is a question of nitrate toxicity in the material you are feeding, whether it's green plant material or stored feed material for hay or baleage, you can do a nitrate test through our university labs. Again, the nitrates are going to accumulate with excessive nitrogen fertilization, moisture stress, or other growth limiting factors. When you send in your forage test, the report that comes back will have your nitrate analysis at the bottom of your forage sample on the lower right-hand side. We want to look at this dry matter column for our nitrate number. Now, this number can look really big compared to the other numbers on a forage sample, but note the units there. These are in parts per million, and they directly align with our UGA nitrate toxicity bulletin where our feeding guidelines are. Here you can see up to 4,500 parts per million is completely safe to feed with adequate feed and water. Above that level, we start limiting the amount of that material in the ration until it reaches greater than 18,000 parts per million, and we do not recommend feeding this material to most animals in many farm cases. A common question that I get is how long will it take to feel the effects of the drought or to recover from this? And it's one of those classic "it depends" answers. Our sandy soils will dry out quicker than our heavy or clay soils because of their more limited water holding capacity. Grass-covered ground will maintain moisture longer than the open soils will. Deeper root systems are able to access soil water resources deeper in the soil profile. You can see that example in the figure here to the right on your screen. When we continuously graze our fields, the animal will take a bite from a particular plant about every 2 to 7 days, and you can see the impact that has on our root structure compared to a plant that was pulled from an area that was allowed to rest for up to 21 days. When we talk about that soil moisture declining in the soil profile, think about this being the soil surface here, and as we start to get drier, that moisture level declining. These plants on the right-hand side are going to lose access to that available soil water very quickly compared to that plant there on the left. Final note here is on stocking rate. Our heavily stocked pastures that are not allowed to rest will see the effects of drought earlier and take longer to recover than if we lowered that stocking rate early into the drought conditions. So we have several current challenges in the agriculture industry that can affect how we respond and see the effects of drought. Many producers that I interact with do not have a contingency plan in place for drought, and that can cause almost a cascade of negative effects down the line. As our fertilizer prices are remaining high, we're seeing less forage produced. Our overstocked pastures, especially once we're in a drought, are going to lead to a rapid decline of resources. We know that we have lower hay stocks available throughout the state, especially with the effects of drought kind of setting in early this year. Many producers are already feeding the hay that they had planned to save for this winter. And if the drought continues with the high fertilizer prices and the lack of rain, we're going to see less hay made from this point on in the season, which means later this fall and winter, there will be significantly less hay available. If all of these factors start to create a domino effect, we can see a potential collapse of the forage system. So while the tactics that we discussed can seem very extreme if you are not currently in drought conditions, it is truly to help prevent the collapse of the forage system and protect that farm for the long term. We are getting a little late this year to be planting any summer annuals, but I wanted to include this information for contingency planning for the future. Pearl millet is one of the most drought-tolerant forage options that we have. This is a warm season annual that's very productive even in drought conditions. It does not have the risk for prussic acid, but it can still develop toxic nitrate levels if not managed correctly. I really like pearl millet to be used in those grazing systems because it's easier to manage under grazing, especially with rotational grazing, than the taller growing sorghums and Sudans. Our forage sorghums and sorghum Sudan grasses are two warm season annuals that are very high yielding and fast growing. They produce a lot of tonnage, which can be difficult for beginner producers to manage under grazing. If you're looking for a variety, we recommend a BMR or brown mid-rib variety, which is this yellow line that you see down the middle. Forage sorghums and sorghum Sudans have the potential for both nitrate accumulation and prussic acid toxicity. One that's not listed here on the screen that you do need to be aware of is these are also prone to sugarcane aphid. This insect is very easy to manage with insecticides at planting and once you're getting closer to harvest or grazing, but it is something else that we need to be scouting for. And during drought events, we're often wanting to minimize our inputs, not be scouting for additional insects. Crabgrass is another warm season annual option. It is very palatable, very digestible, and to the point cattle may selectively graze it over the perennial grasses that you're seeing. We encourage you to choose an improved variety such as Red River or Mojo, which is a blend of Red River and Impact crabgrass. If you are planning on renovating a tall fescue stand this fall, I would be cautious about planting ahead of a new fescue stand just because of the potential for that crabgrass to reseed and cause challenges with the establishment of your new fescue. So because of the time of year that this presentation is being recorded, we're not going to discuss renovation plans for Bermuda grass or Bahia grass because those would occur next season. I do want to spend a moment here to talk about tall fescue renovation plans. And so if you are not in a part of our state that has tall fescue available, because this is limited to the mountain region and upper Piedmont, you can skip to the last slide of this presentation. I have it linked below in the timestamps to talk about general weed control and insect management. So when we're building a tall fescue renovation plan, I like to lead with some warnings because this process takes time and money. It's a worthy investment, but there's some things that you need to plan for. Our renovated pasture will be out of production for a minimum of 8 to 9 months. and so we need to accommodate our stocking rate accordingly. Our novel endophyte seed is more expensive than Kentucky 31 seed, but it will pay for itself later with the improved livestock performance that you are seeing. The final warning is that chemicals are required for this transition. It is very challenging to remove the current fescue or forage stand and be able to safely put that new fescue in without the risk of competition from that previous grass. And so that is why chemicals will be required during this transition to ensure a successful stand. So there's two options for how we can make that transition from one fescue stand to another. The first is called a mow, spray, spray method. And so early in the year, we will mow to suppress seed heads, graze throughout the summer, and then in early fall, right before planting, we're going to start 6 to 8 weeks, spray with a non-selective herbicide, let that herbicide work, and 7 days before planting, spray with another non-selective herbicide application. Again, those dates may change slightly depending on which product you are using, so refer to the pesticide label for the appropriate planting interval. In September to October, then we can go in and no-till drill that new tall fescue planting. The other option is a spray, smother, spray method. In general, we would recommend this method so that we get a really good kill on the toxic fescue compared to the spray plant method. So that means in the spring, we're going to come in with a non-selective herbicide. We will plant a summer annual that can be grazed during the summer to smother out any existing fescue or weeds that are there. Approximately 7 days before planting, we will come in again with a non-selective herbicide to burn everything down before we plant in September to October. After we plant, we need to make sure that we are not grazing or cutting those plants until they reach at least 6 inches tall. Mowing or light grazing can help control weeds and encourage that fescue to fill in, but do not cut or let the animals graze below 6 inches. We do not recommend harvesting for hay until May the following year. And if you want to test for endophyte infection, we're going to do that in April or May of the year after planting. A big important note here that really builds on this drought presentation that we're in is we cannot graze novel endophyte tall fescue in the summer or when the grass is stressed. While the novel endophyte gives us a lot of good plant attributes, it is not as drought tolerant as Kentucky 31 tall fescue is. That's not a reason not to plant a novel endophyte, but it does require us to adjust our management and possibly our stocking rate accordingly. So, final note here that is applicable no matter which forage you're growing in our state is to look at how drought can affect our insect and weed management plans. During these periods, it is more important than ever to get out and scout. That's the only way to really get ahead of these problems that we tend to see in our pasture and hay systems. The Bermuda grass stem maggot is usually not as severe during a drought condition than compared to flood or high moisture conditions because of the preferences of the adult flies, but there's no guarantee that we will not see them. If our grass is growing slower, we may have to adjust our insecticide application days beyond what is typically presented in our management guides. And so, if at 7 days after you harvest or graze, the grass is not greened up and started actively growing, we need to delay that first application of that insecticide until we see that grass green up and start to respond to the nitrogen that we applied and start to regrow. If we have fall armyworms in the area, and there have been several reports already in 2024 sporadically around the state, our threshold for treatment may be lower than normal since our forage is more critical. There are several options available in the University of Georgia Pest Control Handbook to control the fall armyworm, and so we want to make sure that we're picking the right product for the right size worm at the right time of your harvest period. I encourage you to work with your local county extension agent to identify the best product for your farm. The final note here is on weed control. If we are overgrazing our pastures, we're very likely going to see weeds start to increase. We don't want to spray herbicides when our grass is extremely stressed because it can be more vulnerable to herbicides than it would normally. So we want to scout which weeds are there. We may have to use mechanical control or graze them out depending on which weeds show up, and then make a weed control plan for later. Again, options for weed control are available in the University of Georgia Pest Control Handbook, and you can work with your local extension agent to help identify those weeds and build that weed control plan if needed. Thank you for joining us here today. Drought planning and management is never an easy topic to get through. It's one that we should always plan for, but I hope we never have to put these practices into place. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out. I can refer you to your local county extension agent for them to help make you a more tailored, localized plan. You see my email there on the screen. And again, all of the resources that we talked about during this presentation are linked in the video description below. Thanks for joining us, and I hope you come back for another video.